Hey mushroom nerds, it's Anna McHugh. I have a collection of things that I want to show you that I found in my yard and the immediate vicinity. I want to start with a toxic mushroom that is very common. This is called Chlorophyllum molybdites. The common name is the green-spored parasol mushroom, and you can see the beginnings of the green spores coming in on this sort of pale gill surface. So this is a mushroom that is commonly called, again, green-spored parasol. Some people call it the sickener. Reason being, it can cause pretty extreme, although short-lived, gastrointestinal distress. So this is a mushroom that is probably responsible for a lot of the mushroom poisoning events that we have for a couple of reasons. First of all, these are mushrooms that are really common, really conspicuous because they grow in yards, and then they also bear resemblance to edible mushrooms in the Macrolepiota genus. And so I have a video about parasol mushrooms. That's the Macrolepiota genus in general. And they are, you know, again, sort of parasol appearing mushrooms, but they're quite delightful and edible. And so sometimes people will look at Chlorophyllum molybdites and say, oh, that's a parasol mushroom. It must be delicious. They eat it, and then, you know, 6 hours later or so, they start losing everything from their guts from both ends. And then, of course, you know, the mushroom passes through one way or the other, and then the illness resolves. So it is a very unpleasant experience, but for the most part, you know, it is not a life-threatening event unless there's something else very serious going on in your immune system. So I want to talk about how to identify this monster, and then I have a couple of other things, a couple of mushrooms in the Agaricus genus that are edible, so in the Agaricus auricolor group. And then I also have a teeny tiny little Agaricus that I want to show you. And then finally, a weirdo called Xylaria magnoliae, which grows on magnolia cones. So let's get started by returning to our green-spored parasol. So this is a really iconic specimen for a mature mushroom. What you have is a cap and stem mushroom that has gills that start out very pale white, sometimes sort of like a parchmenty color. So they're really quite pretty when they're, you know, brand spanking new. Actually, this is a mushroom that looks, you know, like you don't see any of the green for the green-spored parasol coming in on this mushroom yet. This is another reason that you end up with poisoning incidents, because before the mushroom is mature enough to start showing its green, you know, spores starting to develop, it looks very much like a regular or non-toxic parasol mushroom from underneath. So it has these pale gills, but as the mushroom matures, the greenish spores start to show through, and so you get this sort of gray-green tinging going on, you know, underneath the cap. There's a couple of specimens I have here that are starting to demonstrate the, you know, sort of variability in how greenish it is. When they're very mature, it's almost like a brown green. So actually, this is probably the best of them for it being a sort of like, you know, a little bit sickly greenish color. And again, as the mushrooms fully mature, you'll see that turn like dark grayish green, you know, at the end of the life cycle. Contrast that to Macrolepiota, you know, edible parasol mushrooms. They start out with whitish gills that tend to be more of a like warm creamy color by the time they're mature. And they certainly don't have any of this, you know, greening stuff going on. The other features that make this an identifiable mushroom is their habitat. So these are secondary decomposers. So they grow in grass, they grow in mulch and leaf litter and decompose whatever is sort of resident. You'll find them very frequently in yards and often in large clusters or colonies, sometimes in arcs and rings. This is a mushroom that is great for demonstrating the sheer size of a, you know, mycelial network. So in my case, I have a bush, and these mushrooms are growing all around it. It's probably, you know, 9 to 10 feet in diameter. And that is, like, that ring is the outer perimeter of the mycelium. So this is, you know, fruiting bodies from one individual that is absolutely massive, just sort of hanging out in my front yard, eating whatever is there. You'll see these mushrooms come up, you know, anytime the weather starts to get warm and wet. So, you know, cap and stem. The other features you want to be aware of is you have scales on your cap here, and they are sort of a brownish color, and scaly and sort of peely. Like, they almost look like colored pencil shavings or something similar. So they peel off really easily, and they kind of lift up at the ends. And when they're, you know, quite young, those scales are much darker and much less sort of peely and liftable. So, you know, this is what the babies look like. And this is even more highly resemblant of a, you know, one of the edible parasol mushrooms when they're really immature like that. So you have this sort of, you know, the peeling scales. And I mentioned the peeliness of them because that is actually something that makes Chlorophyllum look different from parasol mushrooms to me, is that the scales and that peeliness and how they're sort of lifted off is a little bit, you know, distinct for this species. A lot of the other parasol mushrooms, the scales are a little more robust, and they're a little bit less like single, you know, little curlicues. They're more of a scale that has multiple, you know, scurfy bits. So it's just a little more difficult to remove them. That is, you know, something that is not super duper consistent. So, you know, but nonetheless, that is something that, like, if you combine that with cap, stem, pale gills starting to turn green, that is a feature to look for. This is also a mushroom that has a partial veil, so that's a protective layer of tissue that covers the mushroom gills when it's a baby, and then breaks and forms this very nice ring on the stem. So some mushrooms have really ephemeral rings on their stems. Here's a really good example. This is one of my Agaricus mushrooms. So you can see it has a ring on the stem, but it's very, like, you know, it's just, there's not a lot to it. It doesn't have a lot of substance. And so it wears off very, very easily. But in the case of Chlorophyllum, I'm going to just pop the cap right off. And what you have here is a stem that's kind of felty and double layered. So on the bottom, it's sort of this brownish, like fawn color, oftentimes with an outer ring. So you have like sort of jaggedy, you know, edges on the outside, and then a nice consistent ring, and then an inner portion. And then on the top, you have, you know, again, white and felty. And then also this little sort of like neck, like there's a little bit of an extra collar that attaches that this ring to the stem. And that's what makes the stem so persistent, or the ring so persistent, is you have, again, an extra little place that basically just pinches the mushroom stem. So as far as staining and bruising reactions, sometimes this mushroom does stain a little bit on the reddish side. I have a collection of them that was really, really red, to such a degree that I didn't recognize them until the greenish, you know, spore started to become evident. Up until that point, I was like, maybe this is Agaricus americanus or something, you know, really delightful and edible. However, you know, for the most part, these mushrooms don't stain a tremendous amount, but there is some variability there. So with, you know, also your parasol mushrooms, your edible parasol mushrooms, a lot of them also have reddish or saffron or maroon staining reactions, and they're all different. So, but, you know, nonetheless, I mention the staining because it's not super typical with Chlorophyllum, but I have seen it. And so seeing a mushroom that looks like this with red staining doesn't necessarily mean that it is, you know, one of the things that's listed as a red staining delicious edible mushroom. So anyway, this mushroom is to be, you know, avoided from an edibility perspective. I certainly love to see them around, though, because they are also a harbinger of a lot of other species out in the woods. So this is a great mushroom if you don't have time to take yourself for a hike to go scouting. If you have a few, you know, minutes to walk around the block and see if you see any of these mushrooms, then you know there's enough moisture and enough activity that going further afield may bear fruit. All right, so that's our Chlorophyllum. Definitely don't eat it. As you can see, I've handled it and I'm not at all concerned. You have to consume and digest this mushroom in order for it to cause you harm. That is the case with other toxic mushrooms as well. So like you can chew on an Amanita phalloides or, you know, the death cap mushroom and spit it out and it won't hurt you. So, you know, similarly, the I think it's an enzyme that just really disagrees with human digestive tracts that's in this sucker. Anyway, you have to eat it, you have to digest it, you have to wait a few hours, and then, you know, by hour 18 to 20, typically you're done feeling really sick. But that really sick, like I know one person I've spoken to who had that experience, and she was like, it was god awful in every respect. And so I knew I knew what had happened because I knew I had eaten a parasol mushroom, and I knew that I realized my identification mistake. So I knew I was not in any danger, but I sure didn't feel very good. Okay, so I'm gonna have a sip of water, then we're gonna zoom through these Agaricus mushrooms and my Xylaria, and I'm going to release you back into the wild to find lots more mushrooms than I have been finding this week. All right, so let's talk about, oh shoot, and I forgot, actually, I'll share this next because this is fancy. So this is Ganoderma curtisii, also known as the golden reishi. These are a little bit worse for wear. They've been around for a couple of days. So what you see here is a mushroom that's kind of like on the woody or corky side. And reishi is historically used in Japanese and Chinese medicine. There are a lot of people that use it medicinally as well in the United States. I am not an expert on medicinal mushrooms, so you'll have to go to other resources for that. But nonetheless, Ganoderma curtisii is really common in the southeastern United States. It gets the name golden reishi because very frequently the younger fruiting bodies in particular have this very pleasing sort of golden color. It is a wood decomposer that grows typically, I find it like at the base of oak or oak stumps. So hardwood for sure, and very frequently you'll find it, you know, sprouting from the ground, but it is decomposing wood that is directly beneath the surface of the soil. And that's one of those tricky things. It's like it's a decomposer, but it's growing on the ground very frequently, and you just have to sort of root around and figure out what it's growing on. So, you know, they're woody and corky, and they're also porous underneath. So instead of having gills or what have you, you have a porous layer. That's where the spores come from. Because these are a little long in the tooth, this is not the color that you want to see. So if you're collecting reishi mushrooms from the wild and you intend to eat them or use them for whatever reason, you want this porous surface to be nice and white. That means that the mushroom is fresh, it hasn't started sporulating. Actually, these I stuck in a box in my car and forgot about them, and they had a little bit of mold on them. So I hosed them off, and when I did, I also got this discoloration. So definitely that is not an ideal. That you want this to be, you know, a nice white surface. As far as the parts of the fruiting body to use, you know, you definitely want to sort of focus on areas that are not super dried out. And also these mushrooms can occasionally get, you know, riddled with beetles and other bugs and things. So anyway, really love to find this mushroom. My favorite thing about them is they have this sort of like Loch Ness Monster or Starship Enterprise sort of appearance very frequently. So sometimes you'll see them in their big fan shelf shaped things, and they can be really large, like the size of a dinner plate, and they're just gorgeous, especially when they're golden and colored. Like, gosh, I think it was the winter of 2020, I found one on a beautiful, like icy cold, I guess it was December. It was right at the end of the year. But anyway, I found one, and it was, you know, covered in snow and just a little, you know, little bits of ice, but it was also this beautiful golden color, and it was just remarkable. Another thing that you'll see is that, you know, the fruiting body is sort of a mahogany color, and often, like after they've been around for a couple of days, you start to see just sort of it becomes a little dull. But when these mushrooms are really fresh, that mahogany can also be very, you know, bright and also very shiny, and so they're really pretty. Again, I don't use them medicinally or for any other purpose except photography, but I can't get enough of them photographically because they're a beautiful shape and beautiful colors as well. Okay, so we got through that. Let's talk about Agaricus mushrooms. These are edible. So these are the Agaricus auricolor group. Auricolor as in like aura, so for gold. So golden colored Agaricus. This is a species group. So Agaricus is a very challenging genus to get to species because, well, it's not very well understood, as with many other, you know, collections of mushroom species. But also, you know, without microscopy and without some fairly sophisticated research and resources, I can get as far as like, I'm comfortable with this as, you know, Agaricus auricolor group, and that's about as far as I need to or am willing to go. But what you have with this particular mushroom is a, you know, cap and stem. All Agaricus mushrooms are cap and stem mushrooms. Oftentimes their caps are a little bit on the like finely scaly side. Oh, I think this other one maybe is a little more evident. So you can see it's just like little itty bitty scaliness here. And with Agaricus auricolor group, you're looking at sort of a like goldenrod colored, you know, scales, but they're, again, sometimes you don't see any scales whatsoever, and in this case they're really quite faint, on top of a yellow to really palish yellow cap. This is one that I'm pretty sure is also Agaricus auricolor group, and I say pretty sure just because I didn't gather it in the exact same location. But, you know, nonetheless, it shows a lot of the same features. You have a little bit of scaliness, but it is also a very, very pale specimen. And so I'm like, it could be auricolor group or not. But these two, you know, I'm pretty comfortable with in that respect. So what you have besides cap and stem mushroom with, you know, this sort of yellowy cap is you have, you know, gills underneath. There's a nice clear separation between gills and stem. As the mushroom matures, what you're going to see, like the mushroom's gills start out very white or pale. And, you know, as the mushroom, and a ring on the stem. And that ring is oftentimes very, you know, ephemeral. Like it's just not a tremendous amount to it. So sometimes these mushrooms, like if they get beaten up, you'll lose track of your ring on the stem. And that's a very common, like, mushroom identification gripe of like, was that a ring on the stem or was that a slug? Like, I don't know. So sometimes you just, you know, lose the necessary identification features. But, you know, you start out with these really pale gills, but what happens as the mushroom gets a little older is that those gills start to turn sort of a pleasing pinky color, and then they start to turn brown. And by the time they're fully mature, it's a dark chocolatey brown. So like think portobello mushroom gill color. And this is the same genus, and so it ends up in the same place with these chocolate brown spores. And that is really, like, that is what you want to look for when you're identifying Agaricus in general, is mushrooms that, you know, they could start with pale gills, but they get, you know, pinky underneath and then get to sort of a dark chocolatey brown. This one is in a space, like the color contrast isn't great, but it's like on the pinky side, and you can actually, with this camera, you can start to see the brown more than I can see from a visual inspection with my eyeballs. So, you know, that is really important for any Agaricus mushroom, including Agaricus auricolor group. And then finally, well, not finally, I have two more features to tell you about. Let's see which of these specimens has the best example of it. Actually, I think it's this little guy. So in addition to your ring on the stem and all the other stuff I've talked about, you also have a little bit of sort of scurfiness at the base of the stem that's like a little bit of yellow material. And it's kind of faint in this case. You can see it most significantly here. So it's just like little rolls of tissue. And it, you know, the stem itself is almost a little on the fluffy side, and the yellow stuff on top is fluffy as well. So, you know, that's oftentimes something that is helpful in identifying this mushroom, despite the fact that you do have this material at the base in a yellow color. Unlike a lot of other Agaricus mushrooms, Agaricus auricolor group is yellow but does not stain yellow. So you have a lot of Agaricus mushrooms that when you handle them will start to stain yellow colors of one kind or another. Agaricus auricolor does not do that. So it's a yellow mushroom, but it's yellow, like inherently so. I mentioned this in particular. Agaricus xanthodermis is a toxic mushroom. It won't kill you, and it smells really, really terrible. But it does have a radically like yellow staining reaction when you handle it and mess with it. And so that's a potential look-alike. They share the same habitats. These are secondary decomposers. So you find them growing on the ground or in leaf litter. These fellows came out of some mulch. So, you know, that's where you might find these mushrooms. The last feature is aroma. So these in particular do not have a very strong smell, but they have a nice sort of almondy aroma to them. And this is a feature of numerous edible and choice Agaricus species. If you read up on Agaricus auricolor in a lot of identification field guides, they mention a very, very strong you know, aroma of almonds, and that can vary in my experience. Like, I've identified this mushroom a few times and have been like, it's a little bit smelly, but not very. This little dude, on the other hand, is like very, very strong aroma of almonds, and it's very pleasing. And so, like, you know, you could superficially look at Agaricus auricolor group or another edible Agaricus, and then look at Agaricus xanthodermis, the poisonous one, and or, you know, one of the ones that's toxic, and they look similar, but as soon as you pick them and smell them, you almost immediately, dead giveaway with Agaricus xanthodermis, it smells like, well, described as smelling like library paste. And I didn't grow up in the right school district to know what library paste specifically smells like, but when I started to explore the different aromas of mushrooms, Agaricus xanthodermis was one of those. I'm like, holy crap, that is glue, is what that smells like. And so, you know, you would not mistake this mushroom for Agaricus xanthodermis as long as you're using your nose to help you with IDs, which you should do. Sometimes I am not as good at that as I should be, because sometimes I'm like, I don't want to put that too close to my face. All right, so we have those Agaricus auricolor. I also wanted to show you, oh, it's a little beaten up and it's not doing so great, but this is Agaricus diminutiva. So the diminutive Agaricus, you have a little mushroom that has all the same features, as far as like this one is really sort of a purple brown color at this point. You know, you have a little ring on the stem, and you know, it's a little dude that grows on the ground, and then also it's got a lot more sort of brown scaliness on top. So you know, it's just sort of a little brown fawn colored mushroom, very small, hence diminutiva. So you know, I'm not going to eat this one. I guess it probably is edible, but I don't know enough about it to really mess around with it, and it's just so stinking small. I'm going to leave it for, I don't know, some of the insects that live in my backyard. Okay, so we've gone through everything except for the one fruiting body that is not mushroom-like at all, but is still very much a fungus. This is Xylaria magnoliae. And so this is, the Xylaria genus is typified by having a kind of branchy and oh, and you can see the spores here. Let me, oh, I blew too hard, but let me just tap it. See, oh, I just got rid of all the spores almost, but you can see a little bit of spore poof come off of these. So essentially you have just sort of fingery or branchy, weird little fruiting bodies. In the case of Xylaria magnoliae, it is very specific to magnolia cones, or as I like to call them, magnolia grenades, because that's what they look like to me. Anyway, it's interesting as well that you have these fungi that are such specialists. So magnolia is, to my understanding, one of the most ancient trees on the planet. And so the amount of time that it took for there to be a little branchy fungus that specializes just on magnolia cones is one of those things. I'm like, this is some very, very ancient lifestyle stuff happening here. And so I always love to see it. The other thing that's really fun about these, and you can see this a little bit, is like the fruiting body when they're mature, they're kind of, you know, gray. Oh, there's a nice shot of that sporulation. Look at that. So it's kind of a gray spore, you know, grayish white spores, kind of smoky. But as I've cleared it off, you can see when the mushrooms aren't yet mature, they're kind of a like mossy gray green color. And speaking of good mushroom pictures from the last few years, I found one of these last year that looked like a little teeny tiny high five. It was the cutest thing I've ever seen. It had 5 little fingers, and it was like, you know, green up to the hand, and then it had these little, you know, sort of like pinky colored tips, and it was just the cutest freaking thing. Anyways, Xylaria magnoliae is also one of the mushrooms that I'm just really thankful for in my own space, because it fruits a lot. You know, I get to see it for several months out of the year. I only have one magnolia tree, but that's all I need to have as much magnolia Xylaria as I want. And, you know, again, because these forms aren't really determinate, you get all kinds of funky little, you know, structures and shapes. And, you know, it has this sort of like marine biological sort of appearance to it. So always a big fan. Thank you for taking the time if you've made it to the end of this video. As you can tell, I am simply beside myself. We have gotten a couple of good days of rain, so I think that there will be much more hunting in the offing soon. I hope you have the best of luck with it, and we'll see you around.